It was never about $50. I just needed her out before the deal closed.
I have been sitting on this bench for over 30 years, and if there is one thing I've learned, it's that the smallest numbers often hide the biggest lies. That Tuesday morning, a case file landed in front of me that made my blood run cold before I even called the first witness. It was an eviction notice for a woman named Mary Jenkins. She was 72 years old, a widow who had lived in the same apartment for over 20 years, and according to the paperwork, she was being thrown out onto the street over a debt of exactly $50. You see, the legal system is often treated like a vending machine. You put in a violation, and it spits out a punishment. But I am not a machine, and I do not tolerate people who try to use my courtroom to crush those who cannot fight back. Mary Jenkins stood at the defense table, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn leather Bible. She looked like everyone's grandmother, kind, quiet, and absolutely disenchanted. Opposite, she was Victor Sterling, a landlord who looked like he had spent more on his silk tie than Mary's entire monthly rent. "Mr. Sterling," I said, leaning forward and letting the silence hang in the air for a moment, "I am looking at your filing. You are asking this court to authorize the forced removal of a tenant who has paid her rent on time for 22 years because of a $50 late fee." Sterling didn't even blink. He had that arrogant smirk of a man who thought the law was just another tool in his investment portfolio. "Your Honor," he replied, his voice smooth and oily, "the lease agreement is very clear. A late fee is a breach of contract. A breach is a breach. I have a business to run." I turned to Mrs. Jenkins. "Mary, tell me what happened." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Your Honor, my Social Security check was delayed by 2 days because of the holiday. I told Mr. Sterling. I paid the rent the moment the funds hit my account, but I did not have the extra $50 for the instant penalty fee until my next check came in. I tried to pay it yesterday, but he refused to take it. He said it was too late. Something was not adding up. I have dealt with greedy landlords before, but nobody goes through the time and expense of an eviction filing over $50 unless they have a much larger prize in mind. Sterling was not just looking for his $50, he was looking for a vacancy. I looked at the property address on the file, Highland Heights. That area had just been rezoned for luxury condos. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "you are a very successful man. You own 12 buildings in this district. Why is this $50 so important to you that you would spend $500 in filing fees just to get her out today?" He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward his lawyer for a split second. "It is the principle, Judge. If I let one tenant slide, they all think they can do it." I did not believe him for a second. In my 30 years, I have seen identity theft, fraud, and corporate greed, but the smell of a dark secret is always the same. It smells like a lie wrapped in a technicality. I looked at Mary, then back at Sterling. "Well, Mr. Sterling, I hope your principles are as strong as your paperwork, because we are going to look at every single line of your Highland Heights ledgers before this morning is over." "Mr. Sterling, you seem very confident for a man who is trying to put a grandmother on the street over the price of a dinner for two," I said, my eyes locked on his. He tried to maintain that practiced corporate composure, but I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. His lawyer, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive gray suit, stood up immediately. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client is simply following the law. The lease is a binding contract. If we do not enforce the rules as written, the entire system of property management collapses into chaos." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The system will not collapse because of $50, counselor, but it might collapse because of greed. Now, bring me the digital ledgers for Highland Heights for the last 18 months. I want to see every late fee and every eviction filing your client has processed in that building. I want to see if this is an isolated incident or a business model." Sterling's face pales. It was a subtle shift, the kind you only notice if you have spent decades watching liars in the hot seat. He leaned over to whisper to his lawyer, his movements frantic and nervous. "Your Honor," the lawyer interjected, "those records are proprietary business information. We believe the scope of this inquiry is overreaching and irrelevant to the simple matter of Mrs. Jenkins's breach of contract." "Denial of records is a quick way to find yourself in disdain in my court," I barked, my gavel resting inches from my hand. I am not interested in your business secrets. I am interested in justice. Mary, while they are pulling up those records, I want you to look at me. Have you ever been late with your rent before this month? Never, Judge Simpson, she said, her voice trembling but clear. My late husband, he was a veteran. He fights for this country. He taught me that your words and your bills are the most important things you own. I have never missed a single day in 22 years until that bank check was delayed by the holiday. I even offered to pay the fee the next day, but they locked the payment portal. I turned back to the screen on my bench, waiting for the court clerk to grant me access to the city's housing database. As the rows of data began to scroll, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that had nothing to do with late rent and everything to do with a predatory plan. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the room, I am looking at your list of tenants. It seems that in the last 6 months you have filed evictions against 7 other seniors in that same building, and every single one of them was for a debt under $100. Does Highland Heights have a sudden epidemic of forgetfulness among the elderly, or is there something much more sinister happening here? The courtroom went dead silent. The dark secret was beginning to crawl out from under the paperwork, and Victor Sterling knew his time was running out. The court clerk handed me a printed copy of the transaction history, and as I scanned the pages, what I saw was not a business ledger, it was a hit list. 7 names, all highlighted in red. All of them were seniors. All of them had lived in rent-controlled units for over 15 years, and every single one of them had been evicted for a debt of less than $100. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that made the entire courtroom dangerous lean in, you did not just happen to have 8 elderly tenants forget to pay their fees. You chose these people. You chose them because their rent was fixed at prices from 20 years ago, and you could not stand the thought of losing a single penny of potential profit. You were not looking for $50. You were looking for a vacancy. Sterling's attorney tried to jump in, but I cut her off with a sharp wave of my hand. Sit down, counselor. Your client is under oath, and I am currently looking at evidence that suggests a systematic pattern of tenant harassment. Mr. Sterling, tell me about the Apex Development Group. I saw their name mentioned in a private memo attached to your tax filings. What is your relationship with them? Sterling wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He was no longer the arrogant businessman who walked in here an hour ago. They are just a firm interested in the property, Your Honor. We have had some preliminary discussions about a sale, but nothing is finalized. It is standard industry practice to keep a clean building for potential investors. Standard practices? I barked, slamming the file shut. Let me tell you what I see. I see a landlord who found out his building is sitting on a gold mine. I see a man who realized that if he could get rid of the long-term rent-controlled tenants like Mary Jenkins, the value of his building would triple overnight. But you had a problem, didn't you? Mary is a good tenant. She is quiet. She pays on time. You couldn't find a legal reason to kick her out, so you waited. You waited for the smallest mistake, a 2-day delay in a Social Security check, to pounce like a scavenger. I looked at Mary. She was weeping quietly, her daughter's arms around her. The realization of how cold-blooded this plan was begun to sink in for everyone in the room. This was not about a contract breach. This was a corporate execution of a woman's life and legacy. Mr. Sterling, I continued, I have just authorized my clerk to issue an emergency subpoena for your emails with Apex Development. I want to see if there is a vacancy bonus mentioned in your contract. Because if there is, this is no longer a simple eviction case. It is a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. Sterling's lawyer looked like she wanted to disappear. Sterling himself looked like a man watching his $3 million bonus go up in flames, and we were just getting started. Victor Sterling sat at that table looking like a cornered rat, and for the first time since he walked into my courtroom, the arrogance had completely evaporated from his face. The air in the room was thick, the kind of heavy silence that happened just before a lightning strike. My court clerk, a woman who has seen every trick in the book, walked back into the room holding a thick manila folder. These were the internal communications I had demanded from Apex Development Group. I took the folder. and as I flipped through the first few pages, I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. It was the heat of pure, unadulterated indignation. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I looked over the top of my glasses, "I am currently looking at an email thread titled Operation Clean House. It was sent 3 months ago from your personal account to the CEO of Apex. Do you want to tell me what that title refers to, or should I read it aloud for the benefit of the gallery?" Sterling's lawyer tried to jump up, her voice high and desperate. "Your Honor, those are confidential negotiations. They are protected by—" I slammed my gavel down once, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Sit down, counselor. Privacy where predatory fraud ends. In my courtroom, there is no hiding place for a man who treats human beings like trash to be hauled away." I turned back to the email. I began to read, and I made sure every word landed like a weight. The email said, "Highland Heights is 60% clear. The remaining rent-controlled units are occupied by long-term seniors. They are difficult to move, but we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for any minor breach. Expect full vacancy by the end of the quarter." And then there it was, the smoking gun. Bonus structure: $10,000 for every senior occupied unit successfully vacated before the October deadline. $10,000. Sterling wasn't trying to collect a $50 late fee. He was hunting for a $10,000 bounty. He was willing to throw a 72-year-old widow who had spent 22 years building a life in that apartment onto the sidewalk for the price of a luxury watch. I looked at Mary Jenkins. She wasn't just crying anymore. She looked shell-shocked. She looked like a woman who had just realized that the person she had called whenever the heat went out or a pipe leaked had been plotting her destruction for months. "Mary," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, "you were never a tenant to this man. You were a line item in a spreadsheet. You were a hurdle between him and a multi-million-dollar payout." I turned my gaze back to Sterling, who was now whispering frantically to his lawyer, his face the color of wet chalk. "Mr. Sterling, you told me earlier that this was about principle. You told me you had a business to run. But what I see here is a man who decided that the law was a weapon he could use to bully the elderly into infertility. You thought that because Mary was old and alone, she wouldn't have the strength to fight. You thought the system would just rubber stamp your greed. But you forgot one very important thing. You came into my courtroom, and in here, $50 doesn't buy you the right to destroy a life. $10,000, that is the number that is ringing in my ears right now, and I want everyone in this courtroom to let it sink in. Mr. Sterling, you are standing here under oath, telling me that you are a man of principles, but your principles seem to have a very specific price tag. For $10,000, you were willing to take a woman who has paid her rent faithfully since the Clinton administration and threw her into a homeless shelter over the price of a bag of groceries. I leaned back in my chair, looking at him with a level of disgust I usually reserve for career criminals. Because that is what this is, Mr. Sterling. This isn't property management. This is a bounty hunt. You weren't looking for a tenant who broke the rules. You were looking for a victim you could exploit. You calculated that Mary Jenkins was old, that she was tired, and that she didn't have the resources to hire a high-priced lawyer like the one sitting next to you. You thought she would just pack her bags and disappear into the night so you could collect your blood money from Apex Development. Sterling tried to speak, his voice cracked like dry parchment. Your Honor, the market is changing. I have a fiduciary responsibility to my investors to maximize the value of the asset. I slammed my hand on the bench, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. Do not use your Harvard Business School vocabulary to dress up a crime. An asset? Mary Jenkins is not an asset. She is a human being. She is a neighbor. She is a member of this community who has contributed more in her 72 years than you will in 3 lifetimes of maximizing value. I turned to his lawyer, who was frantically scribbling notes, likely looking for a way to withdraw from the case before her reputation went down with the ship. Counselor, do you realize what your client has done? He didn't just file an eviction. He manipulated the payment portal. He intentionally created a situation where a minor delay, a delay caused by a federal holiday, became an unfixable breach. He turned a computer system into an executioner's blade. The silence in the gallery was absolute. I could see people in the back rows shaking their heads in disbelief. This was no longer just about Mary. This was about every person who had ever felt small in the face of a giant cold corporation. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping to a low, predatory growl, "you wanted to use the law to make a profit. Well, the law is about to become very, very expensive for you, because I am not just looking at Mary's file anymore. I am looking at Operation Clean House, and I am wondering how many other lives you've already destroyed before you had the misfortune of walking into my courtroom. Mr. Sterling, I have been looking at the metadata of your building's payment portal, and I am finding something that goes far beyond a simple late fee. Mary told me that she tried to pay the $50 the very next morning, but the system wouldn't let her in. You told the court it was a technical glitch or that the grace period had simply expired. But I've spent enough time around hackers and fraudsters to know that computers only do what they are told to do." I turned to my court technician and gave a sharp nod. On the screens behind me, the back-end logs of the Highland Heights payment system began to scroll. "Mr. Sterling, look at the code on line 412. Do you see that command? It was issued at 12:01 a.m. on the morning of the holiday. It is a select block command. And do you know whose account names were on that list? It wasn't every tenant in the building. It was only the 8 tenants on your Operation Clean House list." The room went cold. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gallery. This wasn't just a landlord waiting for a mistake. This was a landlord who had sabotaged the doorway so his victims couldn't escape the fire. You didn't just wait for them to be late, Mr. Sterling. You locked the door from the inside so they had to be late. You intentionally disabled the payment function for rent-controlled seniors while keeping it wide open for everyone else. I looked at Mary Jenkins, whose face was pale with the realization of how deeply she had been gaslit. She had spent weeks blaming herself, wondering why she couldn't get the website to work, feeling the shame of failing at technology in her old age. But it wasn't her. It was a cold-blooded script written by a man who wanted her dead and buried under a luxury condo. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet fury that was more terrifying than a shout. "In legal terms, we call this tortious interference and bad faith. But in my courtroom, I call it digital stalking. You hunted this woman, you tracked her movements, you knew when she checked arrived, and you used your power over the technology she relied on to create a fake crime so you could steal her home." I looked at his lawyer, who had finally stopped writing. She looked like she wanted to crawl into a hole. "Counselor, your client didn't just breach a contract. He manipulated a legal process through fraudulent means. This eviction filing wasn't just wrong. It was a weaponized lie." Sterling tried to stand up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," I barked. "The only reason you aren't in handcuffs right this second is because I am not exposing every single person who helped you write this code." The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, like the air before a massive collapse. Victor Sterling was no longer looking at me. He was staring at the floor, his hands gripped so tightly that his knuckles were white. But I wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. Because once you find one lie in a man's ledgers, you usually find 1,000 more hiding underneath. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice echoing through the chamber. While my technician was pulling those logs, I had my clerk do a cross-reference with the City Housing Authority's subsidy records. And that is where the dark secret gets really ugly. I picked up a single sheet of paper, holding it up like a flag. According to these records, Highland Heights is listed as a recipient of the Senior Housing Preservation Grant. Do you know what that means, Mr. Sterling? It means the taxpayers of this city have been paying you $2,000 a month per unit to ensure that seniors like Mary Jenkins have a safe, affordable place to live. I stood up, leaning over the bench so far that I was nearly face to face with him. You were receiving a government subsidy to protect her while simultaneously plotting to throw her out so you could collect a $10,000 vacancy bonus from a luxury developer. You weren't just double dipping, Mr. Sterling. You were stealing from the public, and you were using Mary as a pawn in a high stakes game of corporate embezzlement. The gallery erupted. I had to slam my gavel 3 times to restore order. Mary Jenkins looked up, her eyes wide with shock. She had spent 20 years thinking this man was doing her a favor by keeping the rent low, never knowing that he was being paid by the city to keep her there, money he was pocketing while trying to destroy her. Your Honor, Sterling's lawyer stammered, her voice shaking. My client, there must be a clerical error. We were unaware of the subsidy status of those specific units. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through her excuse. Unaware? Your client signs the compliance forms every month for the last 5 years. His signature is right here, next to a sworn statement that he was providing stable and secure housing for the elderly. I looked at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, do you know what we call it when you lie to the government to get money? We call it felony fraud. And when you do it to a senior citizen, we call it elder abuse. You didn't just want $50. You wanted the subsidy, you wanted the vacancy bonus, and you wanted to keep your hands clean. But in my courtroom, the lights are on, and there is nowhere left for you to hide. I turned to the bailiff. Officer, I want the district attorney's office on the phone immediately. We are no longer looking at an eviction. We are looking at a crime scene. Sterling finally broke. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands, as the walls of his luxury empire began to crumble in real time. The sound of my gavel striking the wood for the final time echoed like a closing door on Victor Sterling's career. I looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with the cold clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime weeding out corruption. Mr. Sterling, you walked into this courtroom today thinking you were the hunter. You thought a $50 late fee was a sharp enough knife to cut a 72-year-old woman out of her own life. But you forget that in this room, the law isn't a weapon for the greedy. It is a shield for the innocent. Here is my ruling. I am dismissing this eviction filing with prejudice. That means you are barred from ever filing against Mrs. Jenkins for this supposed debt again. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate freeze on all eviction proceedings at Highland Heights, pending a full forensic audit by the Housing Authority. But we are not stopping there, since you admitted under oath to receiving city subsidies while intentionally sabotaging tenant access to payment portals. I am ordering you to pay immediate restitution to Mary Jenkins in the amount of $25,000 for emotional distress and predatory harassment. I turned to Mary, who was clutching her daughter's hand, her face wet with tears. But this time, they were tears of relief. Mary, I said, my voice softening so only she could truly feel the weight of it, you are not going anywhere. This is your home. You have paid for it with 22 years of loyalty, and no digital trap or corporate bonus is ever going to take that away from you. You can go home tonight and sleep in your own bed, knowing that the locks are secure and the truth has been heard. I turned back to Sterling and his legal team, who were already packing their bags in a desperate rush to escape the building. Mr. Sterling, the district attorney's office is waiting for you in the hallway. I suggest you save your breath for them. You came here looking for $50, but you are leaving with a felony investigation and a shattered reputation. You tried to play a game where the house always wins, but you forgot that I am the one who runs this house. I looked out at the gallery, at the law students and the regular citizens who had watched this drama unfold. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can use a technicality to crush a human soul. Justice might be slow and it might be hidden behind piles of paperwork, but as long as I am sitting on this bench, it will always find its way into the light. I picked up my pen, signed the final order with a sharp flourish, and looked at the bailiff. This case is closed. Court is adjourned.